When it comes to shipping, there's plenty of discussions, stories, art, and entire sites that explore every possible combination of relationship. But what about cold, hard facts? What ships actually stand a chance of being canon? And what evidence can be found in the media itself? It's a question I always ask myself when thinking about ships, and today I want to answer it for Deltarune, shortly before Chapter 3 and 4 drop. This game is in a very, very interesting position, especially compared to its predecessor. We're seeing a singular location change over time, and we're constantly watching the characters close to us develop and evolve over the course of the game. While this is cool in general, it also means there's lots of scraps of evidence for ships everywhere. And since Deltarune also isn't done, we're in the unique position of predicting what might happen next. So enough introducing. Let's look at 7 ships between our main cast of characters and see where they currently are and where they might be heading. Starting with Suzel is the ship most central to Deltarune, being between the 2 most important monsters in the game and being the most noticeable part of Noelle's character. While she has a lot more going on, the most prominent point of a lot of her dialogue is how in love she is with Susie. Now, I don't think I need to prove Noelle has a crush on Susie, but for the sake of completeness, here we go. The most specific evidence we get comes from Noelle's talks with her father, which specifically mention a crush in Chapter 1, followed up by Noelle asking Chris a bunch of Susie questions, and then Rudy talking to Susie about Noelle in both endings of Chapter 2. There's also the tea, something we'll be hearing a lot about today. It's heavily implied, but not outright confirmed, that the tea's healing amount depends on how much a character likes the character the tea is based on. I'll be assuming this is the truth from hereafter. Noelle heals 400 HP from Susie T, asking if they sell it in gallons, which far exceeds every other reaction anyone has to the tea. Noelle is in love with Susie. But, is Susie in love with Noelle? Seemingly throughout both chapters, Susie is oblivious to Noelle's crush on her. There's a lot of moments where this happens, some where she's ignorant or dismissive towards obvious signs of the crush, like Rudy talking to her and Noelle asking to stand behind her, while other times she mental gymnastics her way into a different conclusion, like at the start of Chapter 2. Despite everything, Susie remains completely unaware. But this doesn't mean Susie doesn't have a crush on Noelle. Despite all the scenes of Susie being an idiot, she also has various unrelated scenes where she shows developing her unclear feelings for Noelle. After Chapter 2, when interacting with the Rousai doll, Susie mentions Noelle unprompted, and then wonders why she's thinking of her. Then, when Toriel mentions gingerbread, Susie thinks of Noelle again, before quickly dropping the subject. Alright, compared to this, it's not much, but it paints a picture of potential. If the ship is canon, we would expect moments like these to increase in frequency in the future until Susie eventually realizes her feelings. But there is still more to talk about in the present. Susie heals 120 HP from Noelle T, the same as Chris and Rousai. While this is nowhere near the crush level that Noelle is at, this shows that Susie is good friends with Noelle by this point. This might even seem a bit strange, considering how little time she spent with Noelle compared to Chris and Rousai, but I think this can be explained by Susie's eagerness to befriend people and their previous shared history. Susie has never bullied Noelle, which she says is because of the one time she gave her a candy cane pencil, and because Susie remembers her smile? That almost sounds like Susie has always had strange feelings about Noelle that she doesn't understand. Huh. However, there are some who theorize the ship won't end well. Some reason it's because we already got a happy lesbian ship in Undertale, but sticking to the game itself, I theorize it could happen because of Deltarune's obsession with fate and tragedy. Before the start of the game, our 3 heroes are sad and alone. Throughout the events of the game, they've made friends, found hope, found purpose, and maybe that's happening a bit too quickly. Like, it's literally just Chapter 2, and Suzel already seems basically canon. I think there's room for something terrible to happen. The beads in the hospital say they're grimly marching on a set path, not happily. Also, on the topic of terrible things, let's talk Snowgrave. We don't get to see what happens in Noelle's room during the Snowgrave route, but we can tell things went differently. Susie doesn't want to talk about it, wants to move on immediately, and then goes back to see Noelle a couple moments later. She shows some hard-to-read emotions during the dialogue, showing nervousness, but also a confidence and slyness that suggests whatever happened wasn't too surprising or embarrassing. After everyone wakes up, Noelle says the end of her dream was nice, and is incredibly embarrassed when Susie asks what happened. So, what did happen? Did Noelle confess her feelings? Did they kiss? Both seem possible, or even likely, until we later get Snowgrave's specific dialogue showing that Susie is still completely oblivious to Noelle's feelings for her. How can this interaction seem so gay, yet not gay enough for Susie to understand? Queen later says Noelle is in no condition to make a dark fountain and that she must sleep, presenting conflicting ideas of how active Noelle even was. Overall, this discussion has told us nothing and we have learned nothing. Hopefully the coming chapter's continuation of the weird route will explain this scene further, assuming Susie actually tells us what happened. Okay, phew. That took a while, but now we could hopefully move on to an easier ship. Cruzy is not that ship. Susie is just as oblivious to Chris's potential emotions as she is Noelle's, and Chris, unlike Noelle, is much less talkative and also under our constant control. This makes it hard for them to actually voice their opinion on anything, much less communicate a crush. Yet, there's still a lot of evidence to look at, as Chris does a lot with very little. At the end of chapter 2, Susie asks Chris if they want to go to the festival with Noelle or Rousai. Chris is so dead set on ignoring the question's restraints and picking Susie that answering either Noelle or Rousai causes the same confused response. When choosing Susie, she brushes Chris's response off while acting defensive, and when picking, "I don't know how you want me to say this," Chris just stares into Susie's soul. This could just be a sign of friendship though. Chris doesn't seem to be close with anyone before chapter 1 starts, so maybe they're just eager to have a friend at all. Besides, it's not like taking someone to the festival is specifically a romantic Okay, maybe there is something romantic about choosing just one partner to take to the festival. Susie counters this argument by saying of course she'll be there if Chris is there, but she says it all flustered and defensive. Chris also seems to enjoy Susie the most out of anyone. Chris heals 120 HP for Susie T, which while it's an amount normal for Rousai and Susie, this is the most any T heals Chris. While drinking it, they even stare directly at Susie, while Rousai thinks they seem into it, which is, well, it can be read in a very romantic way, but the implications are unclear. The most explicit piece of evidence is when Chris, unconsciously, clicks a link about monsters for humans in your area. This seems pretty damning, but it raises the question of, what monster? There are other options outside of Susie that we'll talk about later that stand as equally possible. That's also assuming this line refers to just one feeling about just one monster, but as we discussed with Suzelle, Toby Fox might be out to break romantic conventions in this game. I still think this line holds up in terms of a crush on Susie though, and is another piece of strong evidence Chris gives us from their few brief real character interactions. So what's Susie's input on this? After the Snowgrave Noelle sequence from before, as Suzelle as that scene seemed, she claims that nothing happened to Rousai, and then says she'll tell Chris later. Is this a sign that Susie trusts Chris most out of anyone, and is willing to tell them potentially embarrassing and even more potentially romantic things? Well, once again, we'd know better if Susie actually followed up on her promise, but the implications still stand. In line with this level of ambiguity, let's talk Susie's relationship with apples. Susie seems obsessed with apples, and we could tell from their reaction to Chris tea and apparent drinking of the apple shampoo that they do enjoy the apple taste, not just the Chris under it. Or, maybe, Susie developed a fondness for apples because they remind her of Chris, which is entirely possible. She also refers to Chris's apple scent and wanting to take a bite of their head twice, in and out of the game. Biting someone's head off can maybe be interpreted romantically. They also just have a lot of good moments together, which show their similar thinking process. There's the moss eating, head in the speaking horn thing, birdseed eating, Rousai doll eating, a lot of stuff like that. During chapter 1, Susie also opens up to Chris first. She starts by ignoring Chris and Rousai, but when forced to team up again, it's Chris she first defends, in the absolute best dialogue in the entire game. This is all more so friendship stuff, But atop everything else we just talked about, I think it's the key to Chris's feelings. Hey, while we're on the Susie streak, let's not forget she gets the same amount of HP from Rouse IT as her other two shippies. Rouse Susie is overshadowed by the previous two ships, likely because of its lack of evidence and because it's straight, but a lot of the same logic applies. Susie and Rousai also spend a lot of time hanging out off-screen during Chapter 2, which is likely what caused their relationship to grow so much. During this time, Susie learns how to do healing magic from Rousai, and Rousai learns sarcasm from Susie. The two also have interesting romantic overtones. At minimum, 2 characters have stated crushes on Susie, and Chris is a close third. Rousai, for his part, is something we'll get to soon. Doomed by the plot to be romantical may not be the best similarity to ship 2 characters based on, but it sure does say something interesting. But let's move on to some real evidence. Rousai repeatedly is the one to push Susie out of her comfort zone, showing unconditional support for her being a hero. While Susie first blows this off, by the elevator scene she starts coming around to it. There's all the stuff about cakes, which is just cute. Same with the hugging scene, which also shows Rousai has no qualms about dispensing physical affection. Susie, for her part, puts her mouth on the Rousai doll. But there's a kind of big piece of evidence that bothers me, because I'm unsure of how to interpret it. Why does Susie react like this at the end of Chapter 1, when Rousai removes his hat? For the player, it's because Rousai looks like Azriel, and that's weird. It would make sense if Chris reacted like that too, but no, it's Susie who gets surprised, and who runs away awkwardly. Did she ever even meet Azriel? Is she maybe reacting like that because he looks like Toriel? That sounds kind of likely, until we get the same interaction later that can't be explained by that. After Chris leaves Susie and Rousai alone again, Susie is seen playing a prank on Rousai by removing his glasses. We very specifically don't see Rousai's face bright until he lowers his hands, where we then see his full face with his pretty pink eyes. Seemingly in response to this, Susie loses her confidence and gives the glasses back. Okay, so, does Susie find Rousai cute? Once again, it seems to be Susie reacting to Rousai in the way that the player should be reacting. We're surprised that Rousai looks like Azriel, and we're weirded out by Rousai's eyes because the game is already filled with Rousai bait. But in terms of what Susie is actually feeling, outside of just being an allegory for us, why is she reacting like this, if not because she too is taking the Rousai bait? Has this goat boy been engineered to be the ire of everyone? I don't get it, and I'm afraid but intrigued if this will be a growing pattern. For the time being, Rouse Susie has some potential to be canon. Rousai. Easily the ship with the most possible baggage. Let's make 2 things immediately clear. A. Rousai shares many connections with Azriel, in design, in name, and there's a personality connection with Toriel, who's the parent to Azriel, and also Chris, which all makes the ship a little strange, to say the least. But it seems weird people would ship 2 characters that seem to have such a family connection, right? Well, B. The player is given constant chances to flirt with Rousai, and Rousai is consistently put in romantic situations. Now, I don't want it to seem like I'm biased against this ship. In fact, I was and maybe still am a Rousai enjoyer. However, to make this ship make sense, we need to reconcile these 2 sides before the end of this discussion. Let's start by flirting with Rousai, in chronological order. You can stand next to Rousai until he blushes. The game calls him a fluffy boy. Rousai tells you to hug the Rousai doll. You can hug Rousai instead, repeatedly, until he admits his lack of experience and goes quiet. Rousai asks Chris to touch his scarf while equipping it. Rousai asks if he looks pretty after giving him the white ribbon, on top of being surprised when you give it to him and later asking if it makes him look cute. He suggests that you should hug him over the doll. He clicks on a link for lighteners for darkeners in your area. Giving the gift to Rousai makes him admit he's never gotten a gift before, and his desire to get one for Chris. Rousai calls himself cute when given the royal pin, and the dress cute when trying to make him equip the mannequin. You go with him into the acid tunnel of love, and you could hug him during a photo, to which he says, "It took a photo of that?" Which is not even mentioning all the before dialogue of being Rousai-like, and him being happy whether you call him a lackey or more than that. He also says it's nice spending time alone with Chris, and if reciprocated, he blushes. Rousai comforts Chris after the Spampton fight. There's the aforementioned Rousai eyes. You can put your mouth on the Rousai doll. You can propose to Rousai. The list goes on and on. Rousai is constantly associated with physical affection, cuteness, comfort, blushing, love, and general romance. It's undeniable, even if it's strange and unclear the meaning of. A lot of this is directed at Chris, but it very well can also be for the player, with Chris as the vessel through which we experience it. The Acid Tunnel of Love name is only found by looking at the OST, after all. Chris, for their part, does not care for Rousai. Rousai T heals Chris for 60 HP, barely above the 50 HP between Noelle and Rousai, two acquaintances. Other than this, there is no evidence for how Chris feels about Rousai, mostly because they get so few chances to express their opinion. When Susie asks if Chris will take Rousai to the festival, Chris instead takes the opportunity to profess their desire to take Susie, and has no unique dialogue for picking Rousai. Seemingly, Chris has no desire to be with Rousai, as much as the plot and Rousai himself seem to be pushing that. This is actually supported by our earlier points. Rousai's connection to Chris's family members only apply if we look at this ship through Chris's eyes. Instead, this flirting does seem to be for the player's sake, and an extension of our control over Chris and us making them do things they don't want to do. This will probably lead to a plot point that's not shipping, which means Rousai is not looking favorable. Unfortunately, since Rousai is a video game character and we are real, the ship that the game is actually pushing also is not favorable. Cryselle is a ship between two childhood best friends, separated for a long time and then reunited to rekindle their relationship. Unlike our last ship, this one has a bit more hope for it, but counter evidence still rears its ugly head. Let's start with the support though. Firstly, from their backstory, we know these two were extremely close. They hung out constantly, Chris pulled pranks on her all the time, Chris would do that weird thing with the piano, and likely much more that we'll learn about later. Noelle even claims Chris is the only one who knows how weird she is, showing she really hasn't gotten close to anyone as much as she has with Chris. But eventually, the two of them seem to have been driven apart, maybe by Dessa's disappearance, Toriel and Asgore's divorce, or whatever drove a wedge between the Holiday and Dreamer family, if it wasn't one of those two previous things. In the current day, the two seemingly have a good time throughout their adventure. Specifically, we see Noelle's theme of nostalgia being fulfilled by hanging out with Chris again. She mentions nostalgia specifically in front of Spampton's store, being reminded of her creepypasta experiences in the past, but a lot of what she talks about in general is the old days, and wanting to go back to them. It's hard to blame her, as the biggest part of the past she wants back is Des, but her relationship with Chris is another thing we see her happy to return to. When getting the gift from Chris, she wonders if they're saying that they want to go back to how things were before. But then there's the tea. Both Chris and Noelle heal 70 HP from each other's teas, which is way lower than the friendship level, 120 HP, and close to the acquaintance level, 50 HP. Chris's reaction provides a lack of like or dislike, while Noelle likes the taste, but dislikes a strange aftertaste. If this aftertaste is referring to our influence, it could suggest Noelle would heal more from Chris T if it wasn't for our control of them, and therefore is better friends with Chris than we can see. But it could also be referring to whatever made the two stop being friends, because as close as they used to be and as close as they're becoming now, something did still happen that separated them. Either way, Chris is still just as low, regardless. Okay, now we have to talk about Snowgrave. In the weird route, Chris begins controlling Noelle. While it is us who is doing it, Noelle shows a very understandable dislike of this. Also in this route, it's required that you say Chris and Noelle are not friends, but something else. Noelle says there's no good interpretation for this, meaning that them dating is one of the bad interpretations. But also that the following interpretation isn't good either. The Addison says dating shoes aren't correct, and instead offers the freeze ring. A ring. Something someone else already associates with marriage, and which Noelle also interprets the meaning of. And which also makes her think of Susie. This route also unlocks the Noelle will ride with me dialogue, showing both a controlling attitude and a romantic theme, with Chris replacing Susie on the Ferris wheel for Noelle. Overall, this route pushes the idea of this toxic relationship between Chris and Noelle, and is maybe saying that, overall, romance between them wouldn't be a good thing. It may also be worrying that this route ends with us killing the one person who says he has a crush on Noelle. So, while there is some evidence for Cressel, the support can be more easily turned to represent friendship, and the game puts a potential romantic relationship between them in an exclusively negative light. Toby Fox likes to include a lot of random ship teasing in his dialogue, but Cressel is really the only one to get nothing. The best we have is the monsters for human line Chris gets, but that's more likely referring to Susie, or potentially. Berdly is an interesting ship, and not just because it's my favorite, but because it's defined mostly by two other ships that didn't even make the cut for this video. These are his crush on Noelle, which he claims to have only had to reciprocate Noelle's crush on him, and his rebound crush on Susie. During his crush on Susie phase, he attempts to kiss her once, and then immediately renounces his crush upon waking up. He actually mentions his idea of Noelle having a crush on him earlier, but it's mostly set up for this joke later, as in the moment it's not even clear what he's referring to. Both of his crushes are treated as jokes, as they're completely unreciprocated and are obviously incorrect, which all paints the picture of a bluebird completely unaware of what romance really is. So, what if he found someone else? I now present to you the one piece of dialogue that supports Berdly. After fighting him for the third time in Chapter 2, interacting with him on the floor twice without leaving the room and bringing Susie back, Berdly states, "Chris, such insistence. Sorry, but I must turn you down. I've chosen Susan's route in the Vienna of life." Which shows that he does consider the possibility of dating Chris, but rejects them only because he's currently trying to romance Susie. So what does this mean for afterwards? Before that though, let's see how Chris feels about Berdly. While we no longer have T to point to, I'd wager that Chris does actually like him. We hear various times about them playing games together, with competitive games where Chris wave dashes, or more cooperative ones like Minecraft. Like with Noelle, we see Chris open to playing pranks on Berdly, which seems to be a form of endearment. Unlike Noelle though, Chris's relationship with Berdly seems more recent. We can even see Chris attempt a prank on Berdly in Chapter 1, as they could follow up on Rudy's joke by asking Berdly to stand by a window. The ship is often framed as something the player is against, but Chris is for, and the evidence in-game actually supports this, as Berdly is generally treated as annoying by the characters in-game, which reflects on the fanbase, while all of the Chris evidence we went through shows that they likely feel the opposite, which is a recurring motif. It also means this ship fits nicely on this diagram, counterbalancing Krausi. But then, there comes the holy grail of Berdly shipping. This might be out of line, since it's from a future chapter, but this dialogue alone is why I made this video. In the Holiday 2024 newsletter, we received this Berdly dialogue from Chapter 4. Listen, it disgusts me to say this, but as an act of charity, I will let you be the breeze under my wings. You, me, festival. This dialogue shows that there is always hope for a ship. No matter how unlikely or how little evidence there is to go off of now, new evidence can always arrive. It means this exercise is worth it, finding all the potential shipping scraps now before things become canon later. Anyway, this dialogue from Berdly is quite cold, somewhat angry, and extremely tsundere. Berdly is actively picking Chris to be his one and only partner at the festival, with very notable amounts of importance placed on this decision. And then the phrase, breeze under my wings, it sounds almost like a pickup line. He almost sounds like he's gritting his teeth at these words, somehow trying to save face, before adding a line so romantic that he did not have to say, as if he's finally speaking the truth he's always wanted to say. It's all quite beautiful, if not a bit subjective. But regardless, I'm beyond excited to see the context around these lines and what they lead to, if only so we can get some more solid evidence. Oh, why can you kill Berdly on the weird route? As a metaphor for doomed yaoi, of course. And that's the 7 ships that I wanted to look at. That gives us this chart of examined ships, colored in by evidence. While Chris and Susie get ships with everyone, I left out Noelle x Ralsei, Berdly x Noelle, Berdly x Ralsei, and Berdly x Susie. For the Ralsei ships, he just hasn't interacted with Noelle or Berdly enough to comment on their relationship. Like, at all. The most we get is Rousai and Noelle exchanging the bare minimum amount of health with each other through their teas. Berdly with Noelle or Susie is explored by the game, but only in the most joking, obviously unserious way, with each being completely unreciprocated, and Berdly later acknowledging both as being fake. Also, now it's a pentagram. Cool. But there's some other ships I want to briefly mention, as in the original cut for this video, I wanted to talk about every supported ship in the game, for a total of 13 more ships to discuss. Of those were the Undertale ship as Garudi, the surprising Nice Pants discovery, the smallest piece of evidence for Desriel, Divorce, 3 ships for Spamton, and getting in on the ground floor of Miketon. All interesting stuff I would have loved to talk about, but I care more about finishing this video before Chapter 3 and 4 come out, and also about ever actually finishing this video. But luckily, once Chapter 3 and 4 drop in a few minutes, there'll be plenty of time to make more videos and do more analysis. I'd love to hear about more potential ships I didn't cover in this video, or things I miss, or even things I got wrong, as I'm certain there's many things I didn't notice or pick up on. But also, remember that in the end, none of this really matters when it comes to writing fanfic or making art. Whether or not a ship is canon should never affect how much you ship it, as despite what I said about Krausai, r/Toothpaste Boys remains impeccably adorable. I just personally enjoy it a lot when the things I like are canon. But that's just a personal flaw. Like an issue of some kind. You know, after making this whole video, I'm starting to wonder if there's something wrong with me.